Welcome back to the second video of this series where I'm walking you through how to build a full stack application using Remix, Tailwind CSS, MongoDB, and Prisma. In the last video, we set up our Remix project, and then we configured Tailwind CSS to work within the project. Next, we set up our Mongo database on Atlas, and finally, we set up Prisma in our project and started to model out and create some data. In this part of the series, we're going to be setting up authentication for our website, which means we'll be building our sign up and sign in forms. We'll be making those all functional, and to do so, we'll be using a couple of Remix's nice helpers for us and storing all of our data in our Mongo database with Prisma. So let's go ahead and jump in and have some fun. All right, so if we take a look in our project, let's just do a little recap of where we ended last time. We have our whole project here set up, and of course, Tailwind CSS is set up in the project. If we look in our app folder, we have this index route here that is pretty much empty. It's just got a couple of tests that we added in to make sure Tailwind was working. And finally, we've got our Prisma schema here with just a user model set up. And we'll be using that model in this video to store some of our users' data when they sign up for our website. The very first thing we're going to want to do, of course, is start up our dev server and see where we're at. So I'll go ahead and run npm run dev, hit enter there. And there we go. Our site's up on localhost 3000, and we get our homepage here. So if we're going to be building out this login screen, we're going to need a new route for that. So ideally, when we go to our website, we're going to want to go to /login, and that's where our screen will be. So to do that in Remix, all you have to do is head over to your routes folder under the app directory and create a new file. And the naming of this file will be important because this is what gets translated to the URL location. So if we do login.tsx, and if we export a component from this file, there's now going to be a login route on our website. So I'm going to just copy over what we've got here for now. And I'll replace this text with, this is the login page. And I'll go ahead and change this function name too. So now, of course, we have our Tailwind CSS page on the root location of the website. But if we head over to login now, we should see this is the login page. So Remix went ahead and set up all of that routing for us. We didn't have to configure anything else. All we had to do is add the file, and it's there. So we've got a blank slate, basically, to start building our application. Over the course of building this application, we're going to end up setting up a couple of different pages. And each of those pages is probably going to have some shared styling, like possibly a background color and the font settings. And I want to build an easy way to share those across our website. So to do so, I'm going to go in my app directory and create a folder called components. And in here, we're going to create a new layout component. And what that's going to do is wrap our page's content and apply styles to the children that are nested within that component. So create a new file in that new directory called layout.tsx, and this will just export a React component. So I'll go ahead and do export function layout, and this will take in a children prop, and we want to make sure that prop is of the type react.reactNode. And the reason we want it to be a React node is just that that will represent the elements nested within our layout component. And this component's just going to be pretty simple. It's going to return a div. And that div is going to render whichever children it was given inside of it. Oops, children. So what we want to do here, though, is give this a class name. And this is going to apply our styles that we define here to any page that we wrap this layout component in. So let's do hscreen. and width full, oops, and BG blue 600, and then font mono. So now anytime we wrap some elements within this layout component, the elements nested in it are going to be the full height of the screen, the full width of the screen, have a blue background, and use the mono font. So that's nice. We'll go ahead and head back over now to our login component so that we can put this to use. We're going to want to import the new component at the top of this page. So we'll type import, and we'll do layout. And we can see here, I hit tab to autocomplete this. This uses the squiggly line slash. So what the squiggly line slash does is it basically puts you at the app directory. It puts you within there, so you can quickly access any folders nested directly under that. So we're going to the components folder and grabbing that layout file. And with that imported, we can actually use that instead of this div here. So I'll do layout and layout. Cool. And I'll go ahead and get rid of these as they're not really needed. Cool, so if we take a look at what this actually looks like in the browser now, we should see our background is applied here, and we're using the mono font. There's a slight difference in that. And it looks like we're good to go building out the rest of this. So now that our shared styles are working, we're going to go ahead and add the actual sign-in form to our login screen. So let's go back into the code here, and we're just going to get rid of this H2. We don't need that anymore. And I'll start us off a div going. And we'll add a class name to that. And we want this form to take up the full height of the screen. So I'm going to do h full. And we want to use actually flex in this because we're going to center our sign-in screen on the page. So we're going to use flex to center it. So we're going to do flex, justify center. I think it's items. Yeah, items, center. And then it will be using flex column. And we're going to give the elements within this div a gap. So let's do gap y4 just to space things out a little bit. Within this div, we'll add a h2, and we'll just say, welcome to kudos. And let's go ahead and see how this looks for now. Cool, so we see our message is now centered in the screen, and it says welcome to kudos. So we're going pretty good so far. That h2 is a little bit boring though, so let's go ahead and add some class names to it. We're going to say that this is a really big header, so we'll do text 5XL. We want it to be extra bold, so font extra bold. And I don't think I mentioned yet, but I have an extension for Tailwind CSS that gives me all of the options that I have here, and that's super helpful. I do recommend it. If you're curious about it, that can be found. Let's see what it's called. Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So that is really helpful when working with Tailwind because there are a ton of options available to you, and this just makes it a little easier to find what you want. But we're going to go ahead and make this H2 yellow. So let's give it text yellow, and let's do 300. Okay, this is great. So now let's go ahead and move on to building the actual form component where we'll put our inputs. So I'm just going to go ahead and open a simple form here. And within that form, we're going to need a couple of inputs, and I'll just go ahead and copy those over with some styling. So what we've got here is a email field, and this is just of the type text, and I've applied some styling here to those, and a password field, and it's a password input. And here's what that's going to look like. Cool. So these are pretty big right now. They take up the full width, and it doesn't really look all that great. So let's go ahead and style up the actual form component itself to sort of rein in how the sizes of that look. And right here, we're just rounding out the form. We're giving it a little bit of a background and some padding. So yeah, that looks a lot better. We've got our email input, and our password input should have the dots there because we're not showing the actual text. The last piece that this is going to need is a button. We need some way to actually submit this form. So I'll go ahead and paste one of those here. So yeah, this is an input. It's type submit because we'll be submitting our form. And then there's a couple of styles in here. I'll point out the transition styles. I'm giving it basically an animation when you hover over the button. So if you're hovering over it, it's going to change the background to a slightly darker yellow and move it a little bit. And here's what that will look like. Kind of cool, just a little extra flair to give the application a little bit better of a look. Okay, so with that looking good, let's go ahead and do a little bit of a cleanup item. These input fields here, these are going to be reused a lot throughout the application as we add more forms and maybe search boxes and stuff on our Kudos feed. So let's go ahead and break this out into a component so we don't have to write the same code every time. And I've actually got a component prepared here. If we go into our components folder and create a new file, form field.tsx, I'll go ahead and just paste this component in and walk through what it does. Here we're just setting up the interface for the properties that we can pass this component. So we'll be able to configure the HTML4, the label that actually gets displayed in the component, the type of input it is, so we can change it between like a text or a password input. These things here, the value and onChange, those will be used to control the value of this component. The parent will store the state and handle any changes that happen to the field. And then finally, we have this error string here, and down here we'll actually be rendering out an error message if one is provided. We'll use that a little bit later when we're submitting the form. I'm going to go ahead to get rid of those squiggly lines. I'm going to import use state and use effect from React. There we go. So those errors should be gone. Cool. And so, yeah, we've got our label here that's going to display our text. We have the HTML4 being set by the properties, so we can configure that from the parent. Whenever the input field is changed, we're going to emit an event that calls a function, giving it the event's value, so we can handle that from the parent. And then also if an input is changed, we're going to reset the error text to null. That way, if an error message is displaying, as soon as the user starts to type in, it'll disappear and give them another chance to submit it correctly. Same sort of thing here. We're configuring some values that were passed by the props. And here we are rendering the error message or just an empty string if one's not provided. So let's go ahead and actually use this and see what it's going to look like. Over in the login page, we'll do import form field from, we'll go to our components folder and form field. There we go. Now that we have that imported, let's actually put it to use in our component. So I'm going to go ahead and delete both of these inputs now because we will be replacing them with a form field. And so what this is going to take in, it'll have this HTML4, and we'll set that to email for the first one. It'll have a label, and that'll be capital case email because we'll actually be displaying that one. The type, we'll leave that blank because it'll be automatically set to text if we don't provide it. But for the, let's look at these options. Value, I'll leave that blank for now. We haven't set up a value. And on change, that one also we'll set up that value in just a second. But let's go ahead and copy these over for our password field. This will be password, and the type will be password as well. Cool. So those are going to be rendered now, but currently they'll error out because we don't have any values or onChange functions specified for them. because of that, let's set up some state to hold those values and a function to actually handle them. So we'll do const, and I'm going to create a variable called form data, and that's going to be a use state. I'll go ahead and import that there, and this will default to a empty email and an empty password. So that's going to be our value. So I'll go ahead and fill that in. Form data.email and form data.password. Now, when these actually change, we're going to have to handle the input change and grab the value from the event. So let's create a new function to do that for us. It'll be called handle input change. And that's going to take in an event. And the type of that event is react.change event. And this will be for an HTML input element. So that's what we'll add there. That'll just give us some nice typing when we are actually interacting with it. And to handle this event, all we're going to really have to do is set our form data. And so we're going to take the form as it is right now, and we will append a value to it. So let's go ahead and actually also have a field, and that'll be a string. That way we can know which field we're updating. So we're going to update the field key, whatever that value is, and we'll do event.target.value. So yeah, we're handling this event by taking the event and whatever field we want to update, and we're going to update that field with the event's target value. And to see what this will look like, this onChange has an event, and then we'll do handle input change E, and for the field, this will be the email field. And I'll copy this over to here, and this will update the password field. So just to see this working, I'm going to go ahead and render out JSON stringify that form data so we can see it change as we type. I'll go back to the page here. So right now it's empty, and now it's going to update automatically as we type in. So that's nice. I will remove that output there, and we will get on to the next piece of this. All right, so with this form looking good, let's start thinking about the next one we're going to have to build. If you remember, we're going to be building this login form, and we're also building a sign up form that's going to look really similar to this, except it's going to have a first name and a last name input. Now, because the two forms are so similar, we're not going to want to create a whole new route to handle this. There'd be a lot of code duplication there. What we're going to do instead is repurpose this form to show a couple of extra fields and perform a different action when you hit the button, depending on which view we want to be seeing. And to do that, go ahead and set up a new piece of state in this page to determine which action we're going to be submitting when we hit that button. And I will explain that a little bit in more detail in a second. But for now, let's go ahead and create an action piece of state and a way to update it. And we're going to default this to login. And the reason we're doing that is we're going to set it up to where when the user first enters this page, they'll be seeing the login form. And now we're going to need to update a couple of different pieces of information here when the different states are being shown. For example, this text says login to give some praise. That's not going to make a whole lot of sense if you're viewing a sign up screen. So let's go and do this. Action equals login. So if the action is login, we're going to show the text that we were showing there. Otherwise, it's going to say sign up to get started. So that way, as the state changes, we'll get a little bit of better context from these messages. And I'm going to do sort of a similar thing here. We don't want that to say sign in all the time. When we're doing a login view, we want it to say sign in. Otherwise, we want it to say sign up. Cool. So we have some of the text now changing based on the different states. We're also going to need to update these form fields to add a couple of extra ones based on the state. So I'm going to go ahead and add a code block here, and we'll say if the action is sign up. Actually, to make this a little bit easier on us, let's go ahead and do if it's not equal to login, because we're only ever going to have two states. Then we are going to render out a couple more of these form fields. And I'll just paste these ones for now. Oh, I missed a question mark here. There we go. And I'll go ahead and put null if it is login. That way, if we're on the login screen, we're not going to show these extra fields. All right, so this is going to be first name. That's what we want to call the field. So we'll go ahead and write this as first name for the label. This will be in state eventually, and we'll update that state here. And we'll do the same sort of thing on this. We'll do last name, and I'll copy this over. We don't need to provide the type here. And there we go. And this is complaining because it needs one element. So let's go ahead and do this as a fragment. Cool. So the last piece to this is actually adding these to the state variable that we have up here. So I'll do first name should be blank, and the last name should be blank. So that's how it's going to start off. So if we go to this page, it'll still render properly, but we won't actually see any of those changes we just made because the default action is going to be a login action. So what we need next is a way to actually change that action. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in a button here that I've prepared, and I'm going to paste that right within the div. And what this is going to do here is create a button, and it's absolutely positioned. So it's going to be at the very top right of the page, and it'll be really similar to the other button we set up where it's going to have those animations when you hover over it. But what it's going to do when you click on it is it's just going to set our action. So it's either going to be login or register, and it'll toggle back and forth as you click it. So let's go see what that's going to look like on our page. You'll see the new button here. It's got the nice hover animation, and then when you click it, there we go. Now we see our sign up to get started. We've got a couple of extra fields here, and our button says sign up. And there is one more change that we're going to want to make to this. Right now, when we submit this form, whichever endpoint that we're going to be submitting to needs to know which action we're actually submitting. That way it'll know if we're trying to log in or sign up. And we're actually going to be using the same endpoint to handle both of those. So let's go ahead and create a way for us to tell the backend server what we're actually doing. And to do that, I'm going to paste in a new button instead of this input button. This is an input of the type submit, but there's a little trick we can do if we use a button within a form. You can actually give a button a form field name, and the only way you can do this with a button in a form is if you actually put an underscore in front of the name. It needs to start with an underscore. I'm not quite sure why, but that's just a convention there. And the value of this form field now is going to be our action. So essentially when we submit our form, all of this data from the input fields is going to be submitted along with the form data to our backend server. And this button will be considered a form field of its own. And it's going to add a new key to that form field data called underscore action. And it will be either login or sign up. And that way we can use that to key off of in something like a switch statement to perform a different action in our code on the back end. All right, so now that our forms are ready to submit data to a backend server, we're going to go ahead and set that up. But before we do so, let's take a look at what our authentication flow is going to look like. I have this little graphic here to display sort of how things are going to work. When a user is taking the login route, they're going to try to log into the form. If the form is valid, they will be moved on, and the code will attempt to actually log the user in. And if that's successful, a cookie session is going to be created because we are using session-based authentication, and they will be redirected to a home screen. But if any of these steps fail, like if they submit invalid data or if the login attempt is invalid, like they inputted a wrong password maybe, they will be sent back to the form with an error displayed, and the values they filled out in the form should be pre-populated so they don't have to retype everything. And then a similar setup is going to happen for the registration form. Their data will be validated. It will attempt to register them. If maybe someone already has the same email that they provided, they'll get sent back with an error. And if they submit invalid data, they will also be sent back with an error. Otherwise, if everything is good, they will be automatically logged in, so they don't have to go re-log in right after they create their account, and redirected to the home screen. So let's go ahead and start that up. Before we do any of this, we're going to need to install a new package called bcrypt.js. We're going to be using that to hash our passwords and to compare passwords when we do any sort of registering or logging in, and we're handling those passwords. So I'll go ahead and paste the command to install that here. We'll do npmi bcrypt.js, and then as a development dependency, we'll install the types for that library because we are using TypeScript. While that's installing, we can go ahead and add a new folder in the app directory called utils. And in here, we're going to add any files that export just utility functions that we're going to use. Basically, we're going to create like service functions in here so that we can split out a lot of our queries into more manageable pieces and keep our code a little bit more organized. So within that, go ahead and create a new file called auth.server.ts. And in here is where we're going to write a lot of our authentication related code, including the queries to create a user, setting up our session bucket, and little pieces like that. The next step here will be to write our register and sign in functions, and those will live here. However, before we do so, we're also going to need to set up the instance of Prisma client so that once we do sign in and register, we can query the database and create new users and things like that. So also in this utils folder, we're going to create prisma.server.ts. And if you're wondering why I'm prefixing all of the files with .server before the extension name, that's because Remix will actually look at those files, and if you have .server before your extension name, it will not bundle that file with the code that gets sent to the client. That way, this code is not exposed to the browser ever. It's only ever on the backend. Which is what we're going to want here because it'll have some sensitive information we don't really want exposed. Now, in this file, I'm going to paste in a snippet. This is a pretty common snippet that you're going to see a lot of places when you're looking into Remix. And what this does is it sets up a Prisma client connection. So it'll go ahead and connect you, and it exports it so that you can import it into other places in your code. But there's also this piece here when you're in development mode where it sets it up as a global variable, and it only connects if there's no connection already available. And the reason it does that is because when we develop on a development environment, we get a live reload feature, which is really nice, but it could cause issues with Prisma because it could cause multiple connections. Every time it reloads, it would create a new connection to the database, and eventually your connection pool would end up drying out, and you would run into some errors. So what this does is it makes sure there's only ever one connection. And this will be, like I said, pretty common. You're going to see this a lot of places. I know this snippet is actually used on Remix's docs. So I stole that from there. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and use this. In the top of our auth.server.ts, I'm going to import Prisma from there. All right, so now that we've got this Prisma instance available to us in this file, let's go ahead and start creating our register function. So I'm going to export a new const called register, and that will be an async function. And the parameter it's going to take in is going to be called form. And yep, so that'll be a function. And we'll give this form a type of register form, which does not yet exist, but I'm going to create a new file in utils called types.server.ts, and I'm going to use this file to create any interfaces or types that we need to share throughout the application. So I'm going to create a new one called, it's an interface, and it's going to be called register form. And our register form has the email field, which is a string. The password is also a string. And first name is a string. And last name, that is a string. Cool. So now that I've got that, I'll import it over here. And now we can use it. So the first thing this register function has to do is it has to check for existing users that have the email that has been provided. We don't want users to be able to create an account with an email that already exists in our system. So we're going to check for that. And if one does exist, then we'll throw an authentication error. So let's go ahead and start writing this query. I'm going to create a variable called exists, and then we'll use Prisma to query for any users who have that email here. So I'll do await Prisma dot, and then I can see the list of options I have here. I'll choose user dot count, and I'm going to count the users where the email field matches the value we got in our form with the email. And the reason I'm using the count function here is mostly just because it returns a number which easily translates to a Boolean, whether it's 0 or above. So if the count is 0 and it doesn't find any records, then it will evaluate to false. And if it does find records, it will evaluate to true. So I'm going to use that here. If exists, then we can return an error. So I'm going to return, and we're going to return the error in a JSON response. And we can use Remix's JSON helper function to do that. And the data this is going to contain, I'll actually paste over. Let me grab that. So we're going to send this error that says a user already exists with that email. And the status of this response is going to be 400, which is an authentication status, an authentication error status. So now that we've got that in place, the next piece here would be to create the actual user, but we don't want to write that in here because this file really just handles authentication related functions. So we're going to create a new file called users.server.ts. And this file will have an import here for Prisma as well, because we're going to be using that. And it's going to need our register form type because we're going to be using that in a second. And then it's also going to use the bcrypt library that we installed. And within this file, we're going to create a new function that creates a user. And I'm just going to copy this and walk through what this is doing. So this is going to, first of all, hash the password that we give it. It's using bcrypt to do that, and we're passing it through 10 rounds of salting. And then the important part here, we're going to create a new user. So this is using Prisma's create function, and the data we're passing it is provided here. We're passing it an email, our password hash, and then this profile key, which is where we want to store first name and last name. But that does not exist yet. This is going to be an embedded document in our Mongo database, and we haven't defined that in our schema. So let's go ahead and define that right now. If you pop open your schema.prisma file, to add an embedded document, you can use the type keyword, and we want to call this profile because this is going to hold our user's profile information. The first field we're going to store there is first name, and that's going to be a string, and last name, that will be a string as well. And then we can add that to our user's model. So we want to have a profile key in our user, and we want that to be of the type profile, which means this will be an embedded document that has the first name and last name in it. So now that that is built in our Prisma schema, let's go ahead and generate Prisma client over again. And we should see this error go away now that we have those fields defined. And yep, There it is. So now if we call this function, it will create a user with an email, a password, and a profile key. And within that profile, it would have a first name and a last name. And then finally, when this user is created, it returns the newly created user here, and we are returning the ID and the email of that new user. So now we'll import that new function into our auth.server.ts file so that we can use it in our register function. So I'll go ahead and do import, create user, and yeah, we'll get that there. And after we've done our check for whether a user already exists or not with that email, we will run our function. So we'll await create user, and we'll pass it our form. And we'll actually store the results of this into a new user variable. That way we can do a little check here to say if not new user. So if a user was not created and returned to us, something must have gone wrong. And we want to return an error response. So we'll return JSON just like we did before. And this will actually return a couple of different things, and I'll paste those in here. Let's see, there we go. And this will be changed to form. So if something does go wrong creating the user, we're going to let the user know and display a user error on the register form. And then we're providing the values that were passed into the email and the password sections. That way we can pre-populate those when the user gets returned back to the form to try again. And then also along the same lines as the last error we returned, we're going to return a status of 400, and that'll be an error status there. And that way we can handle any errors that might occur as we're creating this user. But if no errors happen, then our user must have been created properly. And for now, we'll just return a, let's just say we're returning null from here for now. Eventually what this is going to do is create our new session and redirect the user to the home page. But for now, we're not going to be able to handle that yet because we don't have our session buckets set up. The next piece to build here will be the login function. So we're already handling the registration form. We need to handle the sign-in form next. So we'll export another function here called login. Async. That'll be an asynchronous function. And this form is also going to take in a form variable, and we'll call it login form. And let's go add the new type for that as well. So we'll export another type from here. And I'm just going to copy these over. This is going to take only the email and the password. So login form, and I'll import that here. And just to get rid of this squiggly line, I'm going to add the keyword type here because we're only importing types from that file. Now that we have that available, we're going to fill out the details of this function. So the first thing we need to do is actually find the user associated with the email that we've passed into this function. So let's go ahead and query for that. We'll save it in a user variable, and we'll await Prisma's response for some user information. And we'll use the find unique function here. If you remember correctly, our email field is a unique field in our database, so we can use find unique to key off of that. And we're going to find any users where their email is equal to our form's email. So we should be getting our user details now. However, if we do not get a user, something must have went wrong or the user doesn't exist. So we're going to go ahead and return another error, and I'll paste that over here. There, our error is going to say incorrect login and return a 400 status as it has before. But we haven't quite validated our user is correct yet. We still need to check if the password passed in the form matches. And that's going to use another one of bcrypt's functions to check that hash. So let's also return this error if the passwords do match. And I will paste this in for now, and we'll see what this does in a second. But for First, we'll need to import bcrypt.js, or I'll do bcrypt from bcrypt.js. And this will be the form.password. And so what this is going to do is this will compare the forms password that we provided, so whatever the user typed in to log in with, and it will compare it to the hashed password that we've stored in the database. And it's using this bcrypt's compare function to do that. And it's going to check, hey, does the password that they passed in match the hash that we have stored? And if it does not match that, then we'll trigger this error as well. Otherwise, we are going to return a null for now, but this would create a user session and redirect them to the home page. And with that, we have our register and login functions complete, and we can actually get started on building the cookie session pieces that will store the sessions and handle redirecting users and things like that. So let's get going on that piece. To handle our sessions, we're going to use a nice little tool that Remix provides us that sets up a storage bucket that will handle our sessions, and then we can interact with those sessions from there and retrieve them or delete them or perform any operations on them that we need. So I'm going to import this function called create cookie session storage, and then I'm going to paste in an instantiation of that right here on the top of the file. And what this is going to do is this will create a storage bucket for us that holds our sessions as they're created. And I'm giving the cookie that it creates a name. It's going to be called cookie session. And if we're in a production environment, this will be secure. Otherwise, we're not going to worry about that because this wouldn't work on a local host setting. For secrets, this is going to be airing out for now because we haven't set up a session secret. We're going to need to do that in just a second, but this will essentially be what keeps this cookie secure. And then a couple of these other settings set up the maximum age, so this will end up destroying itself after a certain amount of time. I believe this one is 60 times 60, an hour, 24 hours, 30. So this will be 30 days is how long our session will last. But to set up this session secret here, we're going to need to add an environment variable that holds the secret. So let's open .env, and I'm going to call this variable session secret. And then you can really add whatever secret you want here, make it as secure as you wish. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to write secret. Not very secure, but it'll do the trick. And this will be stored in a new variable called secret. And we can access that using process.env.session secret. And now, one little thing that I'm going to do to make this a little more secure is if there is no secret, I will throw an error. So throw, if I could type here, new error, and this will say session secret is not set. And this will be more of an error for the developer. If they are experiencing any sort of issue with this, they will likely see this error, letting them know that they need to set up their environment properly. Now that we've got a storage bucket to hold our sessions, let's go ahead and create a function that will generate a new session and apply it to our user. So I'll do export const create user session, and that's going to be an asynchronous function. And this function is going to take in two parameters. It's going to take in a user ID, and that'll be a string, and a redirect to, and that will also be a string. And what these are going to be is the user ID of the user that you're creating a session for, and this will be a string that allows you to provide which location you want to send the user to after their session is created. Now to actually create the session, we can use the storage bucket that we just set up. So we'll do const session equals await storage, and then there is a get session function on this. This creates a new session. And next we can do session.set, And we're going to set a value on this session called user ID, and it will be equal to the user ID passed into this function. That way we have some way to associate the session with a actual user. And then after that, we have then created our session. We've set the user ID, and we'll need to redirect the user to whichever location provided here. And to do that, we're going to use Remix's redirect function. So I'll go ahead and import that up here. That is imported from the node piece, and we're going to return that. So we're going to return redirect, and it will redirect to the redirect to URL. And along the way, we're also going to set a header onto the user's browser session as we're redirecting. So we'll do set cookie. We want to set a cookie header, and this will use our storage bucket as well. If I could type here, and it will commit the session that we just created. And this would actually be called headers. There we go. So yeah, we are redirecting to whichever location provided, and along the way, we're going to set a cookie header with the new sessions details that we just created. Now, this function is what we are going to call in our login and register functions rather than returning null. So we'll return create user session, and this one's going to be new user.id, so the new user that was just created, and we're going to redirect to basically just the base route of our application. And similarly over here, we're going to do the same sort of thing, but this will be user.id, so the user that already existed that we found, and it will also be sent to the root application location. And that's all we need to set up our session variables. And at this point, we can actually hook up our form to send a post request to an endpoint that will call these functions and hopefully log our user in. So to actually handle our forms, let's go back to the login page here. And we're going to create an action function and export that from this file. And Remix uses that to set up a post endpoint. So when you export an action function from a Remix route, it will automatically create an endpoint for you that will handle a post request. So let's go ahead and export const action. And the naming here is important. It will look for a function specifically named action. And this will be of the action function type. I'll go ahead and import that there. And this will be an async function. And this function is going to take in a parameter that gives us some details about the request that was made. And let's actually pull out the request object itself from this function. And from that, we can actually get the form data. So I'm going to do const form. Oops. And it will be request.form data. So this allows us to access our forms data, and then we can use this variable here to pull out the individual pieces, just like we would in the browser using the actual form data object. So I'm going to paste some of those in here, just so I don't have to type it all out. Here we're getting the action key, which was the value set on our forms button. We're getting our email and password, and our first name and last name. And you'll notice I used let on these. That's because later on we're actually going to have to set a couple of different changes to these names. So those need to be able to change in the future. In order to validate some of this data, I'm going to just make sure that the email, the password, and the action are of the type string. Otherwise, I'll send an error from the request. So as you might notice, we are only handling the action, the email, and the password keys here. We're leaving out the first name and last name. And the reason I'm doing that is because these three keys are available on both forms, so they're shared across the forms, whereas first name and last name only ever exist on the register form. So I'm actually going to add another block of validation here. And this one is going to say if we are receiving a register action, then check for these first and last name keys. And this is going to return an error. And on both of these, we're returning the action so that when the user is sent back to the form, if they did receive an error, it'll show the correct form. After all of this, once we've verified that we've actually received these strings, we need to verify that the strings themselves are valid. So we want to make sure that a email is of a valid type, that the password is of a certain length, and that the first name and last name are actually filled out if needed. So to validate those, I'm going to create another file in here called validators.server.ts, and I will just paste in a couple of functions in there. These functions are pretty generic, so I won't go into great detail on what they're doing other than saying that this will make sure an email is of a valid format. This will ensure a password is at least 5 characters long, and for any string values or names, this is just going to make sure that there was a value passed to it with some length. And now to use those, I'm going to import them at the top of this file. I'll do validate email, validate name, and validate password. There we go. And then I'm going to use a crafty little piece of logic here to build up an errors object. And what this is going to do, I'll paste it in so that you can see what it looks like. This is going to build an object that contains Boolean values for whether or not there was an error in the given field. So here, if validate email is true, that means everything's good, there's no error. If it's false, there will be an error. Or sorry, the opposite. If validate email returns true, then yes, it did find an error, and otherwise it did not find an error. It'll do the same thing for password, and then here we're conditionally adding a couple of keys to this error object. If there was a form being submitted with the register action, we'll also check if a first name or if a last name was valid. And if any of those were invalid, we're going to return an error. So I've got another piece that I'll paste in here. Cool, so we're going to go through all of the values of the keys in this object that we've created. And if any of them are of a Boolean value, so if it contains a true value, then we'll return an error with all of the fields supplied back to the form so we can refill the form data and with the action. So at this point, we are correctly validating all of our fields. We're making sure everything was passed. We're making sure all of the lengths and formats are correct. And now we need to actually handle the form. So to do that, we will use a switch statement. This switch statement here is going to look like this. So we're going to do switch, and we're going to be keying on the action value that was provided from the form. And that's from the underscore action key up here. And this, as we defined in our form, can have two different states. It's going to be either a login or a register. Oops. And by default, if I could spell that right, by default, if we don't get a login or a register state, we're going to return an error again to let the client know that something went wrong, somehow a invalid action was submitted. But if not, we'll go ahead and handle the login state. And this is just going to return the login function. So I'll do await login. And as we can see here, this is the function that we wrote in the auth.server file. So I'm just going to go ahead and automatically import that up at the top right here. And while we're at it, I will import the register function as well because we're going to use that momentarily. So we're going to do login here, and to this login form, we're going to pass in our email and password grabbed from the form data. And that is after all of this validation takes place, so we know that that is of the correct format. And we don't need to do a break here on the case statement because we are going to be returning to exit out of this function. If this is a register state, however, we're going to return the register function. And And this we're going to be passing in the email, the password, the first name, and the last name. And these are going to give squiggly lines because this function up here that's pulling out this data has the potential to give you a null value. So it can be either a string or null. And this doesn't like that. It wants to make sure that it is a string. So what we're going to do up here is first name equals first name as string. We're going to explicitly type it so that we know for sure that this is going to be a string. And then we'll do the same thing for the last name. And this is giving an error because I had meant to type lowercase string. That's the value that we need here. So now after all of our validation takes place, depending on the action that we are performing, we're either going to log in the user or we're going to register the user. And if we look back at our auth file here, those functions will return this create user session with the root of the website as the location to redirect to. And this will create our session and redirect us to that location. So now that we have this created, let's head back over to our login.tsx file. And we're going to go ahead and set this up to where we can actually submit this form to the action function that we just created. So we're going to need to add the method to this form, and we will set it to post because the post will reach out to our action function that we set up here. And it's been a while since we've taken a look at the actual web page, so let's run dev. And then I'll open this guy up. And if we head over to the login screen, we'll see our login page. There's no user account stored in the database yet, so I'm going to go to the sign up. I'll provide a email, a password, and that. So now when I hit this, it should do a post request to the action route that we set up, and after that, it should redirect us if everything went correctly. And look at that. So it did. It sent us to the home page, which must mean our create user session function was called and the redirect worked. And if we look over in our application tab, we should see in cookies, we have this new kudos session cookie, and this will have our session's value in there. And this is what's used to validate our requests to the server as we navigate through the website. So that looks great. This is all working. The only thing is that we are returning errors from our action function and from our various functions if things go wrong, but we're not actually handling them at all in our form. So that's one of the last pieces we're going to need to build here. In order to actually use that error data, we're going to need to use Remix's use action data hook, which allows us to get access to any data returned from an action function in our route. So I'll go ahead and import that here. I'll import use action data from the React package that Remix gives us. And over in the component, I will use that to get access to that data. So right up here, I'll do const action data equals use action data. Cool. So we now have access to that data, and we're going to go ahead and add those error messages to our form. So I'm going to paste in this little message here that will show up right under our form. And I've pasted this in just because it's going to have some of this formatting for us already, and it will render a form error, but we have not defined that yet. So I will create a new piece of state for that, and that I'll also paste in. This will be for any error that relates to the entire form as a whole. So if maybe you logged in incorrectly, you put in the wrong password, it would let you know in this piece of state here that you have a message to display for that. So I'll go ahead and actually show what that looks like. So if we type in a valid email here, I'll just give it some random characters, and we hit sign in. This is obviously not going to sign us in because we don't have a user with these characters as their email and password. So we should get this incorrect login error message here. If we typed in an invalid piece of data, however, if say this email wasn't validated properly because it doesn't have an @ and it's not a .com or something like that, if we hit sign in, we're going to get no error message. And that's because we're only handling form level errors right now. We're not handling any field level errors. So let's go back into our code and fix that up. To make that change, I'm going to add a new const, and this will be let's just call this one errors. Oops. And we're going to do set errors. And this is going to default to our action data's errors key that we're sending back. Otherwise, it's going to be an empty object. And this is data that we're sending back from our action function if anything goes wrong with the fields themselves. So we have those now. Let's go ahead and apply them. If we go onto here, if you remember correctly, we have our error key that we can add to our form fields. So we'll go ahead and use that. This is the email field. So we'll do, let's do errors and email. So if there is an email key in our errors field, then we will show it because that must mean there's an error available. And this one will be password. And then we'll do the same for these down here. All right, so we should be showing proper error messages now for the form field. So let's go see that in action. I'll refresh this just in case. So if I type in an invalid email, we're going to see, please enter a valid email address. Please enter a password that is at least 5 characters long, because I didn't actually input any password. As I start to type in, the message goes away. We had set that up in our form field component using an effect. And so now I should only get the one error message because the password was valid. And if I now type in this, all valid data, all we get is this one error up here. So this all looks good, but there are still a couple issues with this validation. If you noticed, whenever we got an error response returned, our form was cleared out, which can be inconvenient to the user. Say on the sign up form, if it was a larger form, they'd have to go refill in all of that data, which can take some time. And then also when we did switch to the sign up form, you'll see we still have our error message displaying up here saying incorrect login. And we don't really want that. We want that to clear out when we switch forms so that the context is more clear to what the user is doing. So let's go ahead and handle that. I have a couple of effects that I'm going to use, and I'll paste those in to handle sort of changing that data and responding to changes in the form. However, if we want to use those effects, we're going to have to import the useEffect hook from React. And I'll do that up here. Over here where we're importing useState, I'll also import useEffect, and then we're also going to use a ref in just a second, so I'll import the useRef hook as well. We'll see this first load is still giving us an error. That's because that's where we're going to use a ref. I'll create a new ref called first load, and that will be a useRef. And the default for that will be true. So we're going to use this to determine whether the page has loaded already or not, and I'll explain that right here. In this effect, we're essentially saying if our action key in our state gets changed at all, to clear out the forms and to clear out any errors. And we're doing this because as we navigate in our website to the different forms, I'll refresh this, we want to make sure that if something is filled out here and we hit this button, that the email over here doesn't get that value in it as well. And that's already in effect because I've hit save, so that looks like it worked great. But where the issue occurs is that we now have an effect causing that to happen on any time the action changes. And we also have this effect down here that clears form errors if any of the form data changes. So the result of that is that when our page first loads and we set these values here and we actually set our form data, it's going to cause those to trigger and clear out any errors. And the user ends up not being able to see the error at all because it gets cleared right away. So we're using this first load to determine whether or not to cause those to happen. And essentially, if we're doing a first load, we don't want to clear the state. That way the user gets to see the errors, and the next time something happens to clear those out, it will actually clear out the data. And so that's going to look good here. And I think the last piece we need is we want to pre-fill the form data with the fields that the user had already passed. And that's going to be available to us through action data. As we could see up here a little ways, when we get a form validation error, we are returning all of the fields back that we had passed, so we get the same data. And this way, when the user submits the form and something goes wrong, it won't clear the form. We can actually pre-fill that for them with the data they had already submitted. So, so I don't have to type it out. I'm going to copy over the replacement for this here. It's essentially the same, except we are defaulting it to an action data value. And if that doesn't exist, then we go back to the empty value here. So these effects should allow us to fix the problems we had with our form. And let's go check and make sure that it did. So if we type in an invalid email and no password, we should get our errors here, and we do get to see them. And if we start typing again, that one goes out. Now this one goes out. Now let's try to type in valid data, and it is an incorrect login. That's good. So I'll fill some of this in, and you can see the error goes away. Now if I switch to the sign up form, we should get our data cleared out. And that is exactly what we'd expect. So with that, I think our validation is complete. And the last piece we're going to add in this video is we're going to authorize users on private routes. And what I mean by that is if a user tries to access a route other than the login page, say the home page here, they should be redirected to the login page, and vice versa. If they go to the login page and they're already signed in, they should be sent to the home page because there's no need for them to be signed in again. So let's go ahead and jump into the code, and we're going to go to auth.server.ts. And the first thing that I'm going to add is a file that will basically redirect a user to the login page if they aren't signed in. And to do that, I'm just going to paste in this function here. And there's another function as well that I'm going to paste in. And these two functions are going to be used to redirect to the login screen. So I'm going to use this when the page loads. And basically this function is going to take in the request object and a redirect to. And that'll default to the current location. And so if the user has a session, we're going to just return the user ID. But if they do not have a session, we're going to redirect them to the login page with a redirect to piece in the URL so that once they do log in, they'll be sent back to the page they were trying to reach. And this get user session function is just grabbing the session from the storage bucket based on the request's cookies. And so to actually use this, let's go into index.tsx. This is our home page right now, and let's import that function. And then we're also going to import a loader function type from Remix because we're going to set up a loader. And this is similar to an action function, except this is going to be essentially like a GET request, and it also gets called and loads up some data before the page is rendered. So we're going to use that to check before the page is even rendered if the user is logged in, and if not, we'll send them to the login page. So I'm going to export const loader function, and similar to the action function, the naming here is important. Remix will look for a loader function specifically, so it must be named loader. And this will be an async function. And we're going to pull a request object out of that. And then in here, now that we have our function imported, we are going to call it with the request. And we're going to return null. And so what this is going to do, it's going to call our function in auth.server.ts, which will trigger the checking the session and checking the user ID. And if there's no user ID, then there must not be a valid session and they're going to be redirected. Otherwise, they are let through. And we're returning null because if this does not redirect a user, then we need to return something from our loader, and null is a valid value, so we're returning that. Let's go ahead and head over to the browser to see this working. So if we try now to go to the base route, we are redirected to the login screen with this redirect to. So that's great. Now if we log in, we should be able to reach that page because we have a valid session now. And if we refresh the page, it'll let us stay there. I'm going to go ahead and clear my cookie now so that we can build the next piece. So if I refresh, it'll send me back. Cool. The next piece is essentially doing the opposite. When we're on this page, if there is a user, we're going to need to redirect to the home page. And to do that, we'll also set up a couple new functions in the auth server function or file. And I will get those here and paste them in. So we have this function get user. This is going to be the important one, and this is what we're going to use in the login TSX file. It's going to pass in a request. And based on that request, we're going to get the user ID, and then we're going to try to find a user with that ID using a Prisma query. So here we're finding a unique user where the ID matches, and we're selecting out some of this data for it, and then we're going to return it. However, if we don't find a user, we're going to log out, which will trigger a redirect to the login screen and clear out any cookies. So the reason we're doing it this way is because maybe a user had been logged in, but they waited, say, more than 30 days and their session expired. So the next time they would try to navigate in the page, it would look for the session, it would find a valid user ID session, but then it would determine that the cookie is not valid anymore, and it will destroy the session and return you to the login page. So the way we're going to use this is we're going to import it into our login.tsx file. I'll go ahead and import that here. And then we're going to set up another loader function. So I'm going to import the loader function type up here. And export const loader. Loader function equals async. And from the parameters here, we're going to pull out the request object. And within this function, we are going to return await get user, and we're passing it the request object. And that's get user, not get users. And so this is going to return a user if it finds any. So if it does return a user, we are going to redirect our user to the home page. And this got imported up here. However, if it does not find a logged in user, then we're returning null, which means the page is going to continue loading and it will allow the user to see the login screen. So that's all we need to do there to get that working. Let's go ahead and look at the result. But actually, before we do, I'm going to go back to the code real quick. I need to hit save here so our changes are in effect. All right, cool. So if we go to this form, we'll see if we refresh the page, it lets us stay here. And if we try to go to the login page directly, we are allowed to the login page. But if I sign in, This will send us here. And if I refresh the page, I'm still allowed to be there. But now if I try to go to the login page without clearing out my cookie, it just sends me right back to this page. And so that's what we would want. That's what users come to expect nowadays with authentication on their websites, where if they are logged in, they should just be sent to the home page. Thanks so much for following along with me in this video. In this one, we set up all of the authentication for our website and made sure to take care of any user experience issues that we might run into along the way when it comes to signing in and signing up for our website. In the next video, we're going to be setting up the actual homepage of our Kudos application, which includes the feed of Kudos and a searching and filtering mechanism on that feed, and then also allow the users to send Kudos to each other. So that'll be a fun one, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. Thank you.